The day I found out, I was still in a hospital gown. My left arm had a line in it. My right arm was wrapped in bandages from the elbow to the wrist. The morphine drip was still running, and the ceiling of that hospital room had a water stain shaped like a bird in flight. I remember staring at it. I remember thinking, that bird is the only free thing in this room right now. My name is Alara. I am 34 years old. And the woman who gave birth to me cashed a check for $112,000 that belonged entirely to me, while I was unconscious in a hospital bed recovering from injuries that nearly ended my life. She did not visit me once during those 11 days of recovery. She did not call. She did not send flowers. But she cashed the check. She signed my name. She deposited it into an account I had no access to. And then, 3 years later, standing in the lobby of the Dayton County Courthouse in front of over 130 people, she told a compliance officer that she had done me a favor. A favor. We'll get to that moment. I promise you, we'll get there. Because what happened in that courthouse lobby changed everything. For her, for my father, for my older brother Marcus, who had spent the better part of 2 decades being told he was the one who mattered. But to understand any of it, you have to start at the beginning. And the beginning is not the hospital. The beginning is a yellow kitchen. I grew up in a house on Sycamore Trace Road in a mid-sized city in Ohio. The house was beige on the outside and loud on the inside. My mother, Patricia, we called her Patty, was a woman who believed deeply in appearances. She kept a clean kitchen. She ironed her tablecloths. She sent Christmas cards with a photo of our family and matching burgundy sweaters every single year, even the years when nothing was fine. My father, Gerald, worked in insurance. He was not a cruel man. He was, in the most precise and clinical use of the word, indifferent. He loved my brother Marcus the way some people love a sport, loudly, publicly, with statistics. Marcus was 3 years older than me. Marcus was the state finalist in debate. Marcus went to a good university on a partial scholarship. Marcus got his law degree. Marcus. I was the daughter who came second. Not second in birth order. I was the youngest. I mean second in consideration. Second in conversation. Second in investment. When Marcus needed new cleats for track, my parents bought them that week. When I needed reading glasses in the 7th grade, my mother told me to squint harder and use the library books closer to the window because glasses were expensive. I do not tell you this for sympathy. I tell you this because it becomes relevant, deeply, legally relevant, later. By the time I was a teenager, I had made a kind of peace with my position in the family. I was quiet. I was studious. I worked part-time at a sandwich shop on Elm Street called Granger's, and I saved every dollar I made in a lockbox under my bed. I was not dramatic. I was not difficult. I did not cause scenes. What I was invisible, and invisible children learn to become very good witnesses. I was 22 when I graduated from State College with a degree in public policy. No party, no celebration dinner. My parents came to the ceremony, sat in the bleachers, left before the reception. My father shook my hand in the parking lot. My mother said my gown was a bad color for my complexion. Marcus, who had graduated law school the year before, got a trip to Portugal. I moved into a studio apartment on Birchwood Avenue, started working as a junior researcher for a nonprofit policy center downtown, and began taking evening classes toward my master's degree. I was 22. I was underpaid, and I was genuinely happy for the first time in my adult life. There is something profound and quiet about living in a space where nobody diminishes you. My little apartment smelled like secondhand books and coffee, and I loved it more than I have loved most things since. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late October, a delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection of 5th and Canal, and it hit the passenger side of the car I was sitting in. The driver, my coworker Jenna, walked away with bruises. I did not walk away at all. Not for 11 days. I will not dwell in the medical details for long, because this story is not about my injuries, but you need to know the shape of what happened so you understand the shape of what was taken. The impact fractured 3 of my ribs, collapsed my right lung partially, and broke my right arm in 2 places. 1 clean break near the wrist and 1 hairline fracture near the elbow. I had a concussion that kept me disoriented for the first 4 days. I was in the ICU for 3 days and then transferred to a step-down unit for 8 more. My mother came on the first day. She stayed for 40 minutes. She touched my hand once, looked around the room as if checking for someone more interesting, and told the attending nurse that I had always been dramatic. I was unconscious for part of that visit. The nurse, whose name was Celeste and who I will talk about again very soon, told me about it later. My father did not come at all. He sent a card. It had a generic sunrise on the front and the words, "Hang in there," printed inside. He signed it Gerald. Not Dad, Gerald. Marcus sent a text message that said, and I am quoting exactly, "Heard you got hurt. Hospitals are rough. Let us know if you need anything." He did not follow up. He did not call. He did not calm. I was alone in a hospital bed with a partial lung collapse, and my family's contribution totaled one 40-minute visit, one generic card, and one text message from a man who had passed the bar exam and knew exactly what his obligations were. The accident, because the delivery company's driver was at fault, he had run a red light documented by 3 traffic cameras, qualified me for a personal injury settlement. I was referred to an attorney named Raymond Cho at a firm called Cho & Associates on West Meridian Avenue. Raymond was methodical. Raymond was kind. Raymond spent 11 months building a case so airtight that the delivery company's insurance carrier settled before trial. The settlement amount was $112,000. Raymond called me on a Thursday afternoon in early September, almost a year after the accident. I was sitting on a park bench outside my office eating a granola bar and reading a deposition summary. He said, "Alara, they accepted. Full amount. No appeal." I cried on that park bench. I ugly cried into my granola bar. A man walking his beagle stopped and asked if I was okay. I told him yes. I told him something good had just happened for the first time in a while. I had medical bills. I had missed work. I had spent months in physical therapy at Lakeside Rehab on Commerce Street. The settlement was not a windfall, it was a lifeline. Raymond and I discussed the disbursement plan. He told me the check would be issued within 6 to 8 weeks and would come to my residential address. At the time, I was temporarily staying with my parents. That is the part I need to explain. About 2 months before the settlement came through, my landlord on Birchwood Avenue had sold the building. All tenants were given 60 days' notice. I had been saving carefully, but the rental market had shifted, and I could not find anything in my budget quickly enough. My mother called me, which was unusual, and offered that I come stay in my old bedroom while I looked for a new place. She said, and I remember this because it surprised me, "You're still family, Alara. Come home." I should have been suspicious of the warmth. I had 23 years of data telling me that her warmth was always conditional. But I was healing, I was stressed, and I was tired. So I moved into my old bedroom on Sycamore Trace Road with 2 suitcases and a box of books. And I told myself it was temporary. The settlement check arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was at physical therapy. My mother signed for it. She told me nothing. I found out 6 weeks later when I called Raymond's office to ask about the timeline, and he told me with genuine confusion in his voice that the check had been cashed. He sent me the bank confirmation. My mother had signed my name on the endorsement line. She had deposited it into my parents' joint checking account at First National Bank of Dayton, $112,000. Gone. I want to tell you what it feels like to find out your mother stole from you while you were recovering from a collapsed lung. It feels like falling, but a very specific kind of falling. The kind where you've been warned about the edge your entire life. You felt the ground shaking beneath your feet, and you still somehow did not believe you would fall. I sat in my car in Raymond Cho's parking lot for 45 minutes. I did not call my mother. I did not go home. I drove to a diner on Huron Street, called the Blue Plate, ordered black coffee I did not drink, and sat in a corner booth until my hands stopped shaking. And then, and this is the part that changed everything, I called a woman named Judge Miriam Paxton. Miriam Paxton was not a judge yet at that time. She was the Deputy Director of Consumer and Financial Affairs at the Ohio Attorney General's office. I had met her 3 years earlier through a policy research internship during my master's program. She had been a guest speaker at a seminar on financial fraud and elder exploitation. After the seminar, I had stayed to ask her a question about civil versus criminal jurisdiction in financial crimes. She had answered for 20 minutes. She had given me her card. She had said, "You think the way lawyers think. That's a compliment." We had stayed in contact, occasional emails, a coffee once when she was in my part of the city. She knew about my accident vaguely. She did not know about my family. I called her from that corner booth at the Blue Plate, and I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Alara, don't touch anything, don't confront anyone, and do not go back to that house tonight." I said, "Where do I go?" She said, "Do you have a friend you trust?" I did. Her name was Danny. She had a pull-out couch and a terrier named Biscuit, and no patience whatsoever for nonsense. I called Danny next. I told her I needed a couch. She said, "Tonight?" I said, "Tonight." I said, "Tonight." She said, "I'll put fresh sheets on it." I drove to Danny's apartment on Maple Creek Road, and I did not go back to my parents' house for 3 years. The first thing Miriam told me, and she told me this calmly, the way you explain something important to someone who is frightened but capable, was that emotion is the enemy of documentation. She said, "You are going to want to scream. You are going to want to call your mother at midnight and let her hear what you think of her. You will do none of those things. Not yet. Right now, you are going to build a file." I built a file. Over the next 4 weeks, I did the following. I requested all records from Cho and Associates related to the settlement disbursement. I requested the cash check image from Raymond's bank, showing my mother's handwriting on the endorsement line. I called First National Bank of Dayton and requested a fraud inquiry, which required filing a formal affidavit. Raymond helped me draft it. I obtained my own bank records showing I had received no wire transfer, no deposit, no transfer of any kind. I also, quietly, collected something else. I requested my hospital records from St. Michael's Medical Center, specifically the visitor log and the nursing staff notes for my 11 days of admission. This is where Nurse Celeste came back into the picture. Celeste Gray had been my primary floor nurse during the final 8 days of my stay. She had been present during my mother's 40-minute visit on day 1. She had, as nurses sometimes do out of sheer professional care and documentation habit, made a note in my patient file about the visit. Specifically that the patient's family member had made a comment to nursing staff suggesting the patient had a tendency toward exaggeration. Celeste had flagged it because it seemed clinically relevant to understand the patient's home support environment. That note. In an official hospital record, documenting my mother's dismissal of my condition while I was lying in intensive care, Raymond called it, in his precise and quiet way, corroborating context. Miriam became my guide through what she called the architecture of accountability. She was not my attorney. She was careful about that distinction, and I respected it. But she was my mentor, my compass, and at several points the most grounding voice I had ever encountered. She met with me every other week at a coffee shop near the Attorney General's office building on High Street. She always ordered the same thing: black tea, no sugar, with a side of wheat toast she never fully ate. She brought printed checklists and highlighted things in yellow. She explained the difference between civil fraud and criminal forgery. She explained what the burden of proof looked like in a civil recovery action. She explained what the state bar had to say about attorneys whose clients experienced elder financial fraud, and then she paused and looked at me over her tea and said, "The same principles apply to young adult victims exploited by family members." She gave me a book, not a law book, a journal. It was forest green, spiral-bound, with a small label on the inside cover that said, "Facts, dates, witnesses, amounts, feelings and therapy, not in here." I still have that journal. During this period, I was also, quietly, falling apart in the way that people who are building a case often do. I want to be honest about this part because it is easy to watch someone describe collecting evidence and organizing documents and think they were composed and strategic the entire time. I was not composed. I was a 23-year-old woman sleeping on a pull-out couch with a terrier who snored. I cried in Danny's bathroom more times than I can count. I called my mother twice, once out of grief, once out of rage, and both times I hung up before she answered, because Miriam's voice was in my head saying, "Not yet." I started therapy in January of that year with a counselor named Dr. Phyllis Webb at a community mental health center on Franklin Avenue. Dr. Jate, Webb was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain who specialized in family systems and financial trauma. She was the first person who used the phrase financial abuse in reference to what had happened to me, and hearing it said out loud in a clean, clinical voice cracked something open in my chest. I had spent 23 years believing that being overlooked was just the particular texture of my life. Dr. Webb sat across from me in her small office with its one window and its small plant on the sill, and she said, "Overlooked is a choice someone made about you. It is not a fact about you." That took a long time to believe, but I started writing it down in a separate notebook. That one was not for facts. That one was for feelings. While I was building my case and building my footing, Marcus had been building something else entirely. My brother had joined a mid-sized litigation firm downtown. He had gotten engaged to a woman named Stephanie who was lovely in that particular way that made me wonder what she knew about our family. They had bought a house in the Riverview neighborhood, a nice house, a real house with a porch and a backyard. And from everything I saw on social media, they were planning a large spring wedding. My parents had given Marcus and Stephanie a down payment gift of $30,000 toward that house. I know this because Marcus told me himself in a phone call that happened about 2 months after I had left my parents' house. He called to ask if I was coming home for the holidays. I asked him if he knew what our mother had done with my settlement check. There was a pause. Then he said, "Mom mentioned something about helping you manage it." Manage it. $112,000 that she had forged my signature to steal, and she had told my brother she was helping me manage it. I asked him if he believed her. Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "She's our mom, Alara." I said, "I know who she is." And I hung up. I want to be fair to Marcus here, because fairness matters, and this story does not benefit from painting anyone as purely monstrous. My brother had been raised in the same house I had been raised in, but he had been raised as the person who mattered in that house. He had been given, from his earliest years, the message that the family's resources and attention naturally flowed toward him. He was not malicious. He was, in the most honest assessment I can give, complicit through comfort. He had never had reason to question the family narrative, because the family narrative had always served him. He would have reason to question it later. Miriam connected me with a civil attorney named Howard Briggs who worked in financial recovery. Howard was 61 years old, had a mustache that had been out of style for decades, and wore the same brown leather briefcase every single day. He was methodical and tireless, and he charged me a reduced rate because Miriam asked him to, and because he said when he reviewed my file that the case was as clean as they come. Howard filed a civil complaint for financial fraud and forgery against my mother, Patricia Ann Whitmore, in the spring of that year. Because my father's name was on the joint account into which the check had been deposited, he was named as well, not as a primary actor, but as a co-beneficiary, which carried its own legal weight. The complaint listed 1 count of check fraud, 1 count of forgery of a financial instrument, 1 count of conversion of funds, and a civil demand for full restitution plus interest. My mother received the summons on a Tuesday afternoon. She called me 57 minutes later. I did not answer. She left a voicemail. I still have the recording. She said in a voice that was somehow simultaneously wounded and cold, "Alara, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're tearing this family apart. Call me back." I sent Howard the voicemail recording. He added it to the file. The discovery phase of civil litigation is a beautiful thing when you have documentation and the other side does not. Howard deposed my mother. She maintained, under oath, that I had verbally authorized her to manage the settlement funds on my behalf. Howard asked her to produce any written authorization, any text message, any email, any witness to this alleged verbal conversation. She produced nothing, because there was nothing. Howard then walked her line by line through the bank records showing the funds deposited into her account, then used over the following weeks to pay off my parents' home equity line of credit, which they had taken out 2 years prior to fund, among other things, the Portugal trip when Marcus graduated law school. My settlement money had paid for Marcus's celebration trip. I had been in physical therapy for my broken arm at the same time. There was a mediation session in the fall, required before trial in Ohio civil court. Both sides sat in a conference room at a mediation center on State Street. My parents came in with a family attorney named Carl Berger who looked deeply uncomfortable. My mother wore a blue blazer and would not look at me directly for the first 30 minutes. My father looked at his hands for most of the session. At one point, during a break, my father stepped into the hallway and I happened to be coming out of the restroom. We were alone for about 20 seconds. He looked at me and he opened his mouth and he closed it again. Then he said in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, "I didn't know she was going to do that." I said, "But you kept the money." He didn't answer. I walked back into the conference room. The mediation did not resolve. My mother refused to agree to full restitution. She offered, through Carl Berger, to repay $30,000 as a good faith gesture, characterizing the rest as funds she had used for family expenses that benefited everyone, including me. Howard looked at me across the conference table. I said no. We were going to trial. This is where the timeline becomes important and where I need to slow down and give you the full picture, because the story did not exist only in courtrooms and conference rooms. Life was still happening. I was still living it. During the 18 months between filing the complaint and the eventual resolution, I had moved into my own apartment, a one-bedroom on Larkspur Street, modest and clean, with a kitchen window that caught the morning light. I had received a small emergency fund disbursement from a victims' compensation assistance program that Howard helped me apply for, which covered my first and last month's rent and a security deposit. I had been promoted at my nonprofit to senior policy analyst. I had finished my master's degree. I had started running again. My right arm would never feel quite the same in certain positions, and cold weather made my repaired ribs ache. But I could run 3 miles in the morning and feel something close to whole afterward. Dr. Webb and I had moved from crisis stabilization into what she called identity reconstruction. She said I was no longer in emergency mode. She said I was building something. I asked her what I was building. She said, a self that doesn't require their validation. I wrote that one down in the feelings notebook. Miriam had been watching the case with professional interest from a careful distance. She was not involved directly, she was clear about that. But she had introduced me to Howard, she had given me the framework for documentation, and when I told her about the mediation failure, she said something that surprised me. She said, "Alara, I want to offer you something, not as your mentor, as someone who believes in your professional capacity. We have a fellowship opening at the office. Consumer Financial Protection Policy. It's a 1-year appointment with possibility of extension. I think you should apply." I said, "Miriam, my case is." She said, "Your case is Howard's business. This is yours." I applied. I got the fellowship. I started the following January at the Attorney General's office on High Street, working in the division that investigated financial fraud, elder exploitation, and predatory lending. I was 26 years old, and I was working inside the institution that had the authority to hold people like my mother accountable. I did not tell my family about the fellowship. I was not ready for what that information would mean to them. Not yet. I want to pause here and tell you something about working in consumer financial protection that nobody ever tells you. It is one of the most quietly devastating jobs in the world. Every day you read case files about people who lost their savings, their homes, their retirement accounts, sometimes to strangers, sometimes to institutions, and with striking and depressing frequency to family members. I had a particular personal understanding of those family member cases. My supervisor at the fellowship was a man named Deputy Director Leon Akebe, and after about 3 months, he pulled me aside after a case review meeting and said, "Whitmore, you have a gift for pattern recognition in financial fraud cases. Have you considered law school?" I had considered it the way you consider things that feel possible for other people. But Leon said it like he was telling me the sky was blue, like a fact about me I had simply not yet acknowledged. I started studying for the LSAT that spring. Marcus got married in May on a perfect blue sky Saturday at a venue called the Orchard House outside the city. I was not invited to the wedding. My mother had told Marcus that I was suing the family and that having me present would create tension. Marcus did not call me to discuss this. He sent a text that said, "I'm sorry, it's just complicated right now." I found out about the wedding on social media. Stephanie had posted the photos, beautiful photos, a string-light reception, my parents beaming in the front row, my mother in a champagne-colored dress, my father with his hair combed back, Marcus in his rented tuxedo. I saw those photos at 10:17 at night, sitting on my kitchen floor eating cereal because I had forgotten to buy groceries. I cried. I won't pretend I didn't. But here is what I noticed, sitting on that kitchen floor. I cried for about 8 minutes, and then I stopped, and then I ate the rest of my cereal, and then I went to bed. That was different from how I would have cried a year earlier. A year earlier, those photos would have undone me for days. This time, they hurt, and then they were finished hurting, and I moved forward. Dr. Webb called that a window opening where there used to be a wall. The civil trial was scheduled for a date in late September. Howard was confident. I was prepared. I had spent the better part of 2 years preparing. But something happened 6 weeks before the trial date that changed the shape of everything. My mother filed a motion to transfer to binding arbitration, and Carl Berger attached to that motion an affidavit signed by Marcus, my brother, the attorney, stating that he had personally observed me verbally authorize our mother to manage my settlement funds. He signed it under oath. I sat in Howard's office on the second floor of his building on West Meridian and read that affidavit 3 times. My brother had lied under oath to help our mother steal from me. Howard set down his coffee cup very carefully. He looked at the affidavit. He looked at me. He said, "Alara, does your brother know what's in the discovery file?" I said, "No." Howard said, "He doesn't know about the call logs. He doesn't know about the bank timeline. He doesn't know about the nurse's notes." I said, "No." Howard said, "He filed a false affidavit." I said, "Yes." Howard said very quietly, "I need you to understand what that means for him." I called Miriam that night. I told her about Marcus's affidavit. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Alara, your brother is a member of the Ohio State Bar." I said, "I know." She said, "A false affidavit in a civil proceeding is grounds for professional discipline." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you want to do?" And I sat with that question. I sat with it for a long, long time. Because here's the thing about accountability, and this is something Dr. Cowbility Webb had spent months helping me understand. Accountability is not the same as revenge. Revenge is about making someone hurt as much as you hurt. Accountability is about making sure the truth exists on the record and has consequences. I did not want to destroy Marcus. I wanted him to understand what he had done. I wanted the record to reflect the truth. I told Miriam, "I want the process to work." She said, "Then let the process work." Howard responded to Marcus's affidavit by submitting our entire discovery file, including the bank records with detailed timestamps of the deposit and subsequent fund usage, the hospital visitor log showing my mother's single 40-minute visit, Nurse Celeste Grace patient notes, Raymond Cho's settlement disbursement records, and the voicemail my mother had left me after receiving the summons. He also submitted, and this took my breath away when I read the draft, a second affidavit from Danny, my friend, on Maple Creek Road, documenting the exact conversation in which I had told her about the settlement, the expected timeline, and the fact that my mother had been receiving my mail at Sycamore Trace Road. Danny had kept a text thread between us from that period that corroborated her memory precisely. He submitted it all, and then the trial date was 3 weeks away, when the other side, through Carl Berger, reached out and said, "My parents wish to discuss a full settlement. Before I tell you about what happened at the Dayton County Courthouse, I need to tell you why it happened there and why it was public." A private settlement was on the table. Howard had negotiated the terms, full restitution of $112,000 plus accrued interest at the legal rate and acknowledgement of liability signed by both my parents, and a formal letter of apology, not a verbal apology, a written dated notarized letter, to be delivered to me through counsel. My parents agreed to the full restitution. They agreed to the liability acknowledgement. They refused to write the apology letter. My mother, through Carl Berger, stated that she did not believe she had done anything wrong and that requiring an apology was punitive and cruel. Howard told me this over the phone on a Tuesday morning. I was standing in my kitchen on Larkspur Street making coffee. I set down the coffee pot. I thought about it for about 60 seconds. I said, "Howard, what happens if we proceed to trial and they lose?" He said, "The judgment is public record." I said, "And if I ask for a public reading of the judgment at the courthouse?" He said, At the civil proceeding, the judgment findings are read into record in the courtroom. The lobby of the courthouse has public access. He paused. I want to be very precise about what I'm saying, Elara. I said, I understand exactly what you're saying. We went to trial. My mother did not understand that Miriam's position at the Attorney General's office had grown in the years since we first met. By the time the trial date arrived, Miriam had been appointed as Special Director for Consumer Financial Crimes. She was not a party to my civil case, but her office's findings, which I need to explain, were directly relevant. This is what had happened in the background, in the quiet machinery of institutional accountability. When Howard had submitted the bank records to the court, he had also, with my permission and Miriam's guidance, provided them to the Consumer Financial Crimes Division as a referral for potential criminal investigation. A separate investigation had proceeded in parallel, quietly, for over a year. I had been interviewed. My parents had been interviewed separately, without knowing the other was being questioned. My father, faced with a direct question from a state investigator about whether he had known the funds in his account were from a forged check, had said, and this went on record, that he had not questioned it when Patricia told him the money was a gift from a family account settlement. My mother, questioned separately, had said that Gerald had been aware of everything from the start and had agreed to the plan. They had contradicted each other under state investigation. I did not know this until Miriam called me 2 weeks before the trial and told me, in the careful language of someone managing both a mentorship and a professional obligation, that I should expect a concurrent filing. The trial was scheduled for a Thursday. Howard had filed a notice of intent to have the judgment publicly recorded in the courthouse lobby, in the presence of invited parties and observers, following the proceeding. This was technically proper. Final judgments in civil fraud cases in Ohio are public record and can be read aloud in a public access area of the courthouse. But here is what none of us had anticipated. Marcus, my brother, had, for the preceding 3 weeks, been telling anyone who would listen, his colleagues, his social circle, members of our extended family, that his sister was putting the family through a vindictive legal persecution. He had told his mother-in-law. He had told his uncle, who was a deacon at the family church. He had told his law school study group, 3 of whom were now practicing attorneys in the city. He had done this in the confident belief that the trial would be quiet, that it would resolve privately, and that his affidavit would be a mild procedural footnote. He was about to learn something about the shape of truth. On the morning of the trial, the courtroom held the judge, both legal teams, my parents and me. My parents looked older. My father's hair had gone fully gray. My mother sat very straight in her chair and did not look at me, and I could see, from across the aisle, that her hands in her lap were clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Drummond, which I have always found quietly ironic given my mother's name. Judge Drummond was thorough and without theater. She reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties. She noted on record that the defense had submitted a third-party affidavit from a family member who was also a licensed attorney, and that subsequent review of the discovery record presented significant questions about the veracity of that affidavit. She did not rule on Marcus's affidavit directly in that moment. That was separate proceedings. But she noted it, publicly, in the record. Then she ruled. In favor of me. Full judgment. $112,000 plus interest, plus Howard's court costs, plus a formal finding of fraudulent conversion and forgery of a financial instrument against Patricia Ann Whitmore, and a co-beneficiary finding against Gerald Whitmore. My mother made a sound when the judge read the findings. It was not crying. It was not a protest. It was just a sound, very small, like something breaking that had been under pressure for a long time. We moved to the lobby at 2:17 in the afternoon. I had told no one except Danny and Miriam about the public reading. I had not posted anything. I had not called anyone. I had not, despite the 12 years of accumulated invisibility pressing against the inside of my chest, announced a single thing. But my brother had. He had told so many people about the persecution that a remarkable number of them had decided to come to the courthouse that afternoon, not to support him, but because something in the way he described the situation had sounded to enough people who knew him well off. His study group colleagues were there. His mother-in-law Diane was there. The church deacon, Uncle Roy, was there. Several members of our extended family had come because the courthouse visit had been mentioned in a family group chat my mother had started a month earlier, in what I can only describe as a preemptive narrative management campaign. 131 people in the lobby of the Dayton County Courthouse on a Thursday afternoon. I know the number because the courthouse security log recorded the visitor count. I was standing near the information desk with Howard and Danny when I saw the crowd, and I turned to Howard and I said very quietly, "Did you know about this?" He said, "I knew about some of it." I looked at Danny. She looked at the ceiling. She said, "Marcus told 600 people he was going to win." The Honorable Patricia Drummond had designated a court clerk named Robert, tall man, reading glasses, very serious expression, to read the judgment findings publicly. This was standard procedure. Robert stood at the front of the lobby near the main entrance with the document in hand. Marcus was in the lobby. He was standing with Stephanie near the east wall. He had come because he thought he was going to watch his mother receive a manageable fine and a minor rebuke, and then everyone would go to dinner. He was wearing his good suit. He was standing with his arms crossed, the way he stood when he was in litigation mode. I saw the moment he understood what was happening. It was when the first person from his study group, a woman named Clara who I recognized from photos, turned to look at him with an expression that was not anger and not pity, but something worse, which was professional concern. That expression crossed her face about 60 seconds before Robert began reading, and Marcus saw it, and something shifted in his posture. Then Robert read. Robert read the full findings. He read the dates. He read the check amount. He read the charge of forgery. He read the charge of fraudulent conversion. He read the finding that the funds had been used, in part, to service a home equity debt and to fund family expenditures. Then he read the co-beneficiary finding against my father. And Howard had arranged this, with Miriam's quiet coordination, a representative from the Attorney General's Consumer Financial Crimes Division stepped forward and read a separate concurrent administrative finding. The administrative finding stated that the same financial transaction had been reviewed under the state's financial fraud statutes and had been found to constitute a pattern violation, triggering a compliance order requiring full restitution within 90 days and prohibiting both named parties from being named as financial agents or trustees in any future estate or legal document in the state of Ohio. There was complete silence in the lobby when Robert finished. Not the hell-breath silence of anticipation, the full hollow silence of consequence. My Uncle Roy, the church deacon, sat down on one of the lobby benches. He put his head in his hands. Stephanie, my sister-in-law, took one step away from Marcus, just one step. But in that lobby, in that silence, one step was enormous. My mother stood up. She had been sitting in one of the waiting chairs near the elevator, and she stood up, and she looked at me across the lobby, and she said, loudly enough that everyone heard, "You have destroyed this family. I want to tell you that I said something powerful and precisely calibrated in response. I did not. I had prepared something to say, something calm and factual and final, and when the moment came, I just looked at her. I looked at her for a long time, and then Howard, standing next to me, said in his quiet and completely implacable voice, "Mrs. Whitmore, the judgment is in the record. There's nothing further to say here." My mother looked at Howard. She looked at the crowd. She looked at my Uncle Roy still sitting on the bench. She looked at Stephanie, one step away from her son, and then she walked to the elevator, pressed the button, waited, in full view of everyone, for the doors to open, and got in. My father followed her. The doors closed. Clara from the study group walked over to me. She said, "I'm really sorry, Alara." I said, "I know." The fallout was not dramatic in the way that movie fallout is dramatic. There was no explosion, no screaming match in the parking lot, no viral video. The fallout was quieter and in many ways more final. Marcus's law firm had 3 partners who had been in the lobby. One of them, a senior partner named Douglas, had a particular interest in professional ethics. He called Marcus into his office the following Monday morning. I know this because Marcus told me about it himself, many months later. Douglas said, "Marcus, I need to ask you about the affidavit you filed in the Whitmore civil case." And Marcus, sitting across from a man who had watched the reading in the courthouse lobby, had no good answer. The Ohio State Bar received a professional conduct referral within 2 weeks of the trial. Not from me, from one of Marcus's colleagues who had been in the lobby and was a member of the bar's ethics committee. The referral cited the false affidavit. The bar opened an investigation. Marcus's partnership track was suspended pending investigation. He did not know when he signed that affidavit that he was signing away the next chapter of his professional life. My mother's social media accounts, which she had maintained with great care as a portrait of family happiness, the Christmas card photos, the engagement announcements, the wedding day posts, began to lose followers. I am not going to pretend I did not notice. I noticed. But it was not a source of satisfaction for me the way I might have expected. It was more like watching rain after a long dry season. Necessary, maybe, and real, but also just weather. The church had its own quiet process. Uncle Roy had a conversation with my parents about what he had seen and heard. My parents stopped attending the early service and switched to the evening service. Then, after a few months, they stopped attending at all. A family gathering that my aunt had been planning for the holidays was quietly canceled. Explanations were not given. People understood without being told. I want to tell you about Stephanie. About 3 weeks after the courthouse, I received a text message from a number I did not recognize. It said, "This is Stephanie, Marcus's wife. I'm sorry, I didn't know the full picture. I want you to know that. I think you should know that." I sat with that message for about 2 days before I responded. Then I wrote back, "Thank you, Stephanie. I believe you. We have, in the years since, had 2 or 3 conversations." She is a kind person who had been given a partial and self-serving version of the story by a husband who believed his own version of things. She is in therapy now, too. The marriage is, as far as I know, still intact. But it is different. Things are always different once you see them clearly. My father called me on a Sunday morning in February, about 4 months after the courthouse. He called from a cell phone I did not recognize. Probably one he had bought at a drugstore specifically to call me because he knew I would not pick up his regular number. I picked up. He said, "Ilara, it's your father." I said, "I know." There was a long pause. Then he said, "I didn't authorize what she did. I want you to know that. I didn't authorize it. And when the money was there, I should have asked more questions. I know that." I said, "But you didn't." He said, "No, I didn't." He said, "No, I didn't." I said, "Why are you calling me now?" He said, "Because I've been sitting with it for 4 months and I need you to know that I'm sorry." I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." I said, "I heard you. I appreciate that you said it. It doesn't fix what happened, but I heard you." He said, "Is there anything I can do?" I said, "I'll think about it and get back to you." I told Dr. Webb about the call at my next session. She said, "How did it feel?" I said, "Smaller than I expected, and also more real." She said, "That's about right." The restitution funds arrived in full 39 days after the judgment, delivered electronically to an account in my name at a credit union on Hoover Street. $112,000 plus interest. Howard's fees came from that. The state administrative fine came out of my parents' assets separately and went to the Consumer Protection Fund. What was left after Howard's fees was enough to change my life, not in a flashy way. I am not that kind of person, but in the way that having a foundation changes things. I put a significant portion into a diversified investment account. I put another portion into an emergency fund large enough to make me feel, for the first time in my adult memory, genuinely secure. I used a portion to pay off the remaining balance on my student loans, and I did one thing that was entirely impractical and entirely necessary. I hired a woodworker on Dexter Avenue to build me a bookshelf, floor-to-ceiling, honey-colored oak with a small integrated desk section. I had admired bookshelves like this my whole life and told myself they were for other people. I put it in the living room of my apartment on Larkspur Street, and I filled it with every book I had been collecting since I was a girl in a yellow kitchen who had to squint to see the blackboard. That bookshelf is the most honest thing I own. I passed the LSAT at the end of that year. I was accepted to a law school program in the spring, starting the following fall. Liana Shebe, my supervisor at the fellowship, wrote my recommendation letter. He wrote, and he read me this line before submitting it. Ms. Whitmore has a particular and uncommon capacity for holding the full complexity of a human situation without losing sight of the facts. This is the rarest quality in legal work, and she has it naturally. I start as a first-year law student in the fall. I tell you this not to complete a tidy arc, but because I want you to understand what the money actually represented. It was not the money that mattered. The money was a proxy for the acknowledgement, the formal, institutional, public acknowledgement, that what had been done to me was wrong, that I had been wronged, that my injuries were real, and my claims were valid, and the people who diminished me had been wrong. The money was the proof. Now let me tell you about the conditional mercy, because this is the part people always ask about. About 8 months after the courthouse, I received a letter through Howard from Carl Berger, still acting as my parents' attorney. The letter stated that my parents were requesting contact, specifically that they were asking if I would consider a supervised communication arrangement. Howard reviewed it. Then he forwarded it to me with a single line, "Your call entirely." I brought it to Dr. Webb. We spent 3 sessions working through it. She did not tell me what to do. That is what good therapy is, not being told what to do, but being given enough space to hear yourself think. What I eventually decided was this. I would allow communication under specific, non-negotiable terms, not because I forgave them. Forgiveness is something I have come to understand as a private process. It happens in your own chest, at its own pace, and it has nothing to do with whether the other person deserves it or asks for it. I had already, in some quieter internal way, begun that process. Not for them. For me. Because carrying that much weight takes a physical toll, and I had been through enough physical tolls already. But contact is a different thing from forgiveness. Contact requires trust, and trust requires demonstrated change. My terms, communicated to Carl Berger in writing, were as follows. My mother was required to attend 12 individual therapy sessions with a licensed therapist, verified by letter from the therapist's office. Not the content of the sessions, just confirmation of attendance. This was non-negotiable and had to be completed before any communication. Both of my parents were required to sign a document, notarized, acknowledging the civil judgment and confirming that they did not dispute the facts as found. If they wished to continue contact after the initial period, it would consist of 1 brief call per week, no longer than 10 minutes, with no discussion of Marcus, no discussion of the legal proceedings, and no requests for financial assistance of any kind ever. If any of these terms were violated once, contact would end permanently and I would not revisit the decision. Carl Berger communicated my terms. My parents, after a period of silence that lasted about 6 weeks, agreed to all of them. My mother attended therapy. The therapist confirmed attendance in a letter. My parents signed the notarized acknowledgement. The first call with my mother lasted 7 minutes and was largely about the weather and a book she had been reading and a neighbor's dog. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a while. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt something closer to neutral, which, after a lifetime of turbulence, felt like the most luxurious thing in the world. 3 months after the terms were established, I came home one afternoon to find an envelope tucked under my door. Not mailed. Hand-delivered. Which means someone knew my address. The envelope had my father's handwriting on the front. Inside was a small object wrapped in tissue paper and a handwritten note on cream paper. The object was a key. It was a small brass key, old and slightly tarnished. When I turned it over in my hand, I recognized it. It was the key to the lockbox under my childhood bed, the lockbox where I'd kept the money I earned at Granger's sandwich shop. I had not seen that lockbox or that key since I was a teenager. The note said, "Alara. I found this while going through the storage room. I thought you should have it. You worked hard for what you saved, even then. You always did. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. Dad." I held that key for a long time. I will not tell you it healed everything. It did not. It was a key to an empty lockbox. But it was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had received from him in over 30 years of living, and I will not minimize it by saying it didn't matter. It mattered. I put it on the bookshelf, between the second and third shelf. where I can see it when I'm reading. Let me tell you about Marcus. Because that story did not end the way I expected. The bar investigation concluded with a formal censure, not disbarment, but a public censure and a mandatory ethics continuing education requirement. His partnership track was delayed by 2 years. He lost standing in his professional community in a way that I understand, having observed it from the outside, felt like losing a piece of his identity. I did not know what to do with that. There was a part of me, and I am going to be honest about this even though it is not comfortable, that had some satisfaction in it. Not a clean satisfaction. A complicated, uncomfortable satisfaction mixed with grief. The way you sometimes feel when a person you love gets exactly the consequence they earned, and you have to sit with both the justice and the loss of it. About a year after the censure, Marcus called me. He called from his own number, which surprised me. I stared at the name on my phone screen for 3 rings and then I answered. He said, "Alara." I said, "Marcus." He said, "I filed a false affidavit." I said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't. I told myself it was true. I told myself Mom had mentioned it and that probably she had authorization and that you were being—" I said, "Marcus." He stopped. I said, "You knew what you were signing." A long pause. He said, "Yes." I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay?" I said, "Is there something you need to tell me or are you asking for something?" He said after a moment, "I'm telling you I'm sorry. I don't expect anything from it." I said, "That's probably the right expectation to have." We stayed on the phone for another couple of minutes talking about nothing in particular. Then I said I had to go. He said, "Okay." He said, "Maybe, sometime if you want." I said, "I'll think about it." I have not called him back yet, but I have thought about it. I want to take a moment before the end of this story to tell you something that I think matters more than the judgment, more than the courthouse lobby, more than the key on the bookshelf. The thing that saved me was not the settlement. It was not the attorney, or the mentor, or the civil case. Those things were instruments. Tools. Legal structures through which the truth was allowed to be verified. What saved me was this. At 23 years old, sitting in the corner booth of the Blue Plate Diner with a cup of coffee I did not drink, I did not call my mother. I did not call my brother. I did not collapse into the narrative they had been telling about me my entire life. That I was dramatic, that I was difficult, that my pain was exaggerated and my needs were unreasonable. I called someone who had looked at me and said, "You think the way lawyers think. That's a compliment." I called the person who had given me her card after a seminar because she believed I was capable of understanding something complex and important. Miriam Paxton gave me something that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with identity. She gave me back the belief that I was someone worth taking seriously. From that one decision, everything else followed. The documentation, the case, the fellowship, the law school application, the bookshelf. The bookshelf. I am going to tell you something that Miriam said to me last spring when we had coffee at our usual place on High Street. She has now been appointed as the State Attorney General, the first woman to hold the position. I had attended her swearing-in ceremony and cried, and then immediately felt embarrassed about crying, and she had hugged me and said, "You're allowed." We were sitting with our usual order. She still gets black tea with wheat toast she doesn't finish. And she said, "Do you know what I remember about that first seminar? The question you asked me after?" I said I remembered it. She said, "You asked me about the difference between institutional accountability and personal vengeance. You were, 22? And you framed it in exactly those terms. Institutional accountability versus personal vengeance." She shook her head. "Most attorneys don't think about that distinction with that clarity. You were a kid asking about it philosophically and then your life required you to live it." I said, "I didn't really know the distinction when I asked. I just had a feeling there was one." She said, "There is, and you found it. Institutional accountability is what happened in that courtroom and in that lobby. The record shows what my mother did. The record shows what my father allowed. The record shows what Marcus signed. Those facts exist now in the official documentation of the civil proceedings and in the administrative findings of the Attorney General's office. They are not rumors. They are not my version of events. They are findings. Personal vengeance would have been calling my mother at midnight. It would have been the posts I drafted and deleted in the early months. It would have been showing up at Marcus's office. It would have been any of the 12 different scripts I wrote in my head in the corner booth at the Blue Plate. I did none of those things. I did not do them because I am a saint. I am not a saint. I am a person who was very lucky to have someone put a forest green journal in my hands and say, "Facts here." Feelings in therapy. The process did what the process was designed to do. When you feed it the right information in the right format at the right time. I want to speak directly to you now, not as a narrator, not as a character in a story. As someone who has come out the other side of something and wants to hand you what they found there. If you are in a family that has made you small, the cruelest thing they have ever done is not the specific act. It is the years of preparation that make you doubt whether the act was real. The years of hearing your pain called dramatic. The years of watching resources flow around you. The years of being told in 1,000 small and large ways that your worth was conditional and your needs were inconvenient. That preparation is the crime. The check, the forgery, the affidavit, those were the symptoms. The disease is being told repeatedly that you are less than, and the cure, and I use that word carefully, because cures are slow and imperfect and require many doses. The cure begins the moment you call the person who looks at you as if your thinking is worth something. The moment you open the green journal. The moment you sit in Dr. Webb's office with the one window and hear the word abuse used to describe what was done to your finances, your confidence, your claim on your own life. The cure begins with documentation. It continues with community. It does not end. Not really. It becomes something you maintain. Like running 3 miles in the morning. Like the ache in your ribs when the weather changes. Like the weight of a small brass key in your hand. I sleep through the night now. I want you to understand what that means. For years, through the accident, through the recovery, through the discovery, through the case, I did not sleep through the night. I woke at 2 and 3 in the morning with a grinding physical alertness, the body's alarm system triggered by the persistent background hum of threat. Not imagined threat, real threat. The threat of a family that had never been safe. I sleep through the night now, not because justice is complete, not because my family has been transformed. My mother is still at her core, the woman she has always been, the woman who straightens her tablecloth and sends Christmas card photos, and who will, I suspect, continue to revise the story of what happened into something she can live with. My father is still a man who waited too long and said too little, and handed me a key when what I needed was a voice raised on my behalf at the time it mattered. Marcus is still working through what he did. Stephanie, I think, is helping him in the way that people help each other when they choose to stay. Honestly, and without comfort blanket illusions, none of this is a fairy tale. None of it ended with the people who hurt me being fully corrected by consequence. But it ended with the record reflecting the truth. And it ended with me living in an apartment on Larkspur Street with a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf and a morning run and a therapy appointment on Thursdays and a law school admission letter on my desk. And I sleep through the night. Here is what I know now that I did not know in the yellow kitchen on Sycamore Trace Road. Your family's treatment of you is not a verdict on your worth. It is data about them. Documentation is not cold. It is the opposite of cold. It is the most disciplined form of care you can show yourself. The act of saying, "What happened to me is real and I will prove it." Anger is not your enemy. Unprocessed anger is your enemy. Anger, given the right container, a green journal, a therapist's office, a civil filing, becomes evidence. Accountability requires witnesses. That is why the lobby mattered, not because I wanted my mother humiliated, but because the truth, heard only in private, remains deniable. The truth, witnessed by 131 people, becomes permanent. Mercy does not require forgetting. You can offer someone a path to contact and still hold the record. You can put a key on a bookshelf and still maintain your terms. You can say, "I heard you" to your father without saying everything is fine. And perhaps most importantly, the people who diminish you in childhood are counting on you to continue to shrink. The most subversive thing you can ever do is grow. Get the fellowship. Take the LSA. Build the bookshelf. Grow. I started my first year of law school in September. My professor for civil procedure, a thin, sharp woman named Professor Ellison, handed out the syllabus on the first day and said, "The law is not magic. It is documentation, precedent, and process. Your job is to understand those three things with enough clarity to make them work for people who need them. I wrote that down. I wrote it in the green journal, which I still carry. The facts section is full. I bought a second one, same brand, same forest green, same spiral binding, for the next chapter. I do not know yet what that chapter holds. I know it includes law school. I know it includes Thursday therapy appointments. I know it includes the weekly call with my mother, which is strange and brief and not particularly warm, but which exists. Which is to say the line is open and we are in the smallest possible technical sense, in contact. I know it includes Danny, who now has a second terrier named Crumble, and who I had dinner with last Saturday, and who made me laugh so hard I knocked over a water glass. I know it includes Miriam, who drinks black tea with wheat toast she does not finish, and who changed my life by giving me her card after a seminar because she thought I asked a good question. I know it includes the scar on my right arm from the wrist to the elbow visible when I reach across a table, a physical record of the accident that started all of this, a reminder that I was broken open and healed, and the fractures made me stronger in the places they mended. I know it includes the key on the bookshelf, between the second and third shelf, and I know it includes this, whatever this is, this telling, because somewhere someone is sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee they're not drinking, and their hands are shaking and they've just found out that someone they loved did something that should not have been done, and they are trying to figure out which direction to go from here. If that is you, here is where you go. You go to the green journal. You go to the attorney. You go to the therapist with the one window. You go to the friend with the pull-out couch. You go to the mentor who looked at you once and said something that made you feel like you were real and serious and worth the effort. You build the file. You document everything. You feed the truth into the process that was built to hold it. And then, and this is the hardest part and the most important part, you live. You keep living. You run in the morning. You build the bookshelf. You sleep through the night. This is not revenge. This is your life. Take it back. If this story resonated with you, you are not alone. More people than you would believe have sat exactly where you are sitting with exactly the weight you are carrying. There are resources, legal aid offices, victim advocacy programs, therapy sliding scale programs that exist for people who need them. You do not have to carry this without help. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves out there.